Okay. All right. So it was brought to my attention by a friend of mine that I had not really. She said to expound a little bit about the relationship between time, money, energy, and money. I'm like, okay, so let me try and do this because this is a hard one to explain, but I'm going to do my best here. So kind of bear with me here. Remember what I said before, you're born with one currency. You don't get all the other currencies that are out there in the world. You're born with the currency of time. That's it. Now, you have to convert that into, you convert your time, which is your energy, into the local currency, whatever that is, whether it's dollars or anything, pounds, etc. You have to do that by doing something. Right? So that's the relationship in it. It's really, I'm trying to break it down. I don't want to get it too complicated because I get into the weeds here, but that's how it kind of works. When you have your time, you're exchanging that. The idea is, and this is what's sold at a lot of the get rich quick things and a lot of the scams out there. The scams appeal to people because what they're appealing to is your desire to have more coming in, more energy, money coming in than outgo of time. More income than outgo, right? The problem is that has to come from somewhere, okay? And now you can say that, well, okay, so the free market idea goes like this. If I make a product, right, and people want to buy it, right, then they're going to pay me more for it than what it cost me to produce, because otherwise I'm not going to produce it. I'm just going to go do something else. So that's the theory behind it, and that's actually very all things being equal in a true free market, that's what you end up getting. The challenge comes in when you start creating systems where you're not actually doing anything. You're trying to get other people to do it for you. That's where the problem comes in. And this is the problem, is that, and this is where I'll get accused of, by all the people on the right. They'll say, well, that's Marxism. Like, no, I'm not pushing labor theory of value. I'm saying that when you add a fiat currency into the mix, you completely distort both ends of the market. All of a sudden, someone doesn't know what their labor is worth because they don't know what their money's worth. So when before I tear into inflation, because it's actually part of inflation, and these are just notes here, so I'll attack these as we go on other successive videos. But what ends up happening is that it creates a distortion. So if I offer to pay you, let me start in the beginning here. You don't work for money. I don't know if you know that or not, but you don't actually work for money. Your goal is what the money will buy you, right? You understand? You're not actually trying, like, do you really care about green paper dollars? Like, nobody really cares about the actual dollars. What they care about is what they can buy with it. That's what they're after. So I'll give you a real world example. My grandfather, right, in 1964, I think, was promised a pension. He worked for Sears, Roebuck and Company, and he was an appliance delivery guy. So he would deliver appliances, and he wore the cap and the jacket, and he had the dolly, and would deliver appliances to people's houses. So what would happen is that he made, I want to say like maybe $400 or $500 a month. I don't remember exactly what the number was, but it was like $400 or $500 a month back in the early 60s or early mid 60s. Well, that actually wasn't too bad of money back then. Because back then you could still buy a house, you could buy a car, you could pay for food and groceries, you could even go on vacations. You may not have had lavish vacations, but you could go on vacations. So what happened is that he was promised that if you do all this work for us, because the company didn't really have the money to pay anybody for reasons that we'll kind of bore into as we kind of go along with all this. Most of these companies didn't have the money to actually pay anybody. So they promised him these ridiculous pensions later on, figuring that, well, okay, the guy's going to die by the time he's like 72. So yeah, let's go ahead and create these ridiculous pensions and get these people working for chasing this dream later on, the dream of retirement, which is a lie, by the way. I'm just, spoiler alert, there's no such thing as actually retirement. Retirement is when, when you're dead, okay? When your time runs out, that's retirement. So they promised these pensions. So when he was, I want to say, so he would have been in his, like, I want to say early 30s. And the idea was when he retired sometime in the 80s, he was going to get, like, I think $1,100 a month in retirement benefit. What's called a defined benefit pension. Those don't exist really anymore. And the challenge with that was that, well, okay, first of all, there's no way for these companies to actually pay that. How can a company pay you more in the future when you're not working than they can pay you right now? I mean, like, this is a negotiation problem. By the way, we're going to get into negotiation, and I'm going to teach you advanced negotiation as well. I bet you didn't think you were going to learn that with this, but for every reaction, there's an equal opposite reaction. That's the whole idea behind financial physics. And a lot of people don't know how to actually negotiate properly because they don't even know the math behind all this stuff. They don't understand how they're going to be screwed by time, and putting their time into a company that wasn't worth it. And my God, there's a lot of companies not worth it. You could almost throw a dart, and it's pretty much not worth it. So, so they promised him all this money. So when he was going to go to retire, all of a sudden, cut to the mid 80s, and all of a sudden, that's not a lot of money anymore because of devaluation of the currency. So this is the challenge that ultimately that a lot of the boomers have, and a lot of people, unfortunately, on the so-called right out there have a problem with this, because no one's bothered to explain this in detail enough to understand that, well, but wages are going up. Like, yeah, but spending power is going down. That's the problem. So spending power is dropping faster than the increase in wages. This creates a massive distortion. So now let's go back to what I was saying before. You don't work for money. What you're working for is what the money will buy you, right? We talked about this before in another video. So if the money starts being worth less and less and less progressively, you need to make more and more and more of it. Okay, so think of it as like think of it if you were to like peg your wages, whatever it is that you want for whatever it is job you do, to a specific lifestyle, not necessarily a dollar amount, right? Does that make sense? So like, okay, so you want to have, well, this just came out. This came out a couple of days ago. $493,000 is the median home price. Median, that's an N, not an M. Median home price, $493,000. The old calculation would be you take that by a third, and that's roughly what you would have to earn on an annualized basis for a bank to consider you to be a good risk to purchase that home. And by the way, I will tear into the lie of banking. There's a lot to unpack. just you're going to bear with me here. This, by the way, this is predominantly this series is going to be predominantly more focused on folks who really don't understand any of this, that have never been shown this. And I've run into people with MBAs who don't know any of this stuff. So, I mean, like, you're not going to learn this in the colleges. The institutions are going to, unless you get the same education Kissinger got, you're probably not going to learn any of this, or a lot of this is you're not really, or you're going to have to learn it on your own. You're going to go travel around the internet, and you can probably find a few people and everything, but most of them are going to want to have, they want money. I don't really want anything from you. Frankly, there's not a lot that anybody could really give me that I would particularly want. I'm pretty, provincial, I suppose. There's not a whole lot that I would want, and I'm not after your money. I want you to know all this stuff, because if you know all this stuff, this actually will create a better world. Believe it or not, that's actually what I got out of this. If you understand all this, it actually will create a better world just by you understanding both sides, and that's actually really important that you understand both sides of it. Not just all the guys out there running around screaming, I want free shit because, Marxism. Like, dude, that's not realistic. Or the people that are saying, no, just work harder. Like, that's not going to work either. Because if hard work and sacrifice were indicative of money, then every roofer in Houston in August would be a billionaire. So hard work has nothing to do with that, right? You understand that? That's not exactly, they're not the same thing. This idea that gets bantied about with intelligence, which I'm not a big believer in IQ science. I think there's probably something to it, although probably not for the reasons that a lot of the psychometricians and the psychologists and psychiatrists might think. I have my own kind of theory on that, but I think that they're getting a bad read. When you're suggesting that, well, the number one indicator of success is intelligence or IQ, it's like, well, okay, there's a lot of other factors that go into that are not necessarily environmental. But environmental, but depending on how it was, on what kind of starting playing field they had, right? I mean, in other words, let's say you had a really, 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 really intelligent kid, but they grew up in abject poverty, and they didn't have any access to anything. Well, they're probably not going to be very successful. They're just reality. They're not going to be super successful. At the same time, you have somebody who's really intelligent, but they're born to an upper middle class family. Bill Gates comes to example. By the way, that's not a criticism of Bill Gates. He openly admits this. He had access to a lot of things that most people didn't have access to. Technology at the time that most other folks didn't have access to, and he had access to it at a younger age. So he was able to kind of grow up with that kind of technology. This isn't a criticism at all. It's an observation. So, in other words, it's like going from a million to a billion is going to be a lot easier than going from 0 to a million. Does that make sense? So if you're going to divide this by 1/3, the number is 165K. Approximately 165K. Is what you'd have to earn. Well, how many jobs out there are paying $165,000 a year? Not a whole lot. And if they do, in the areas that are paying that, then the median home price is probably $790,000. So it's like there's no real way to keep up with this. What's causing all of this? Well, that's the inflation part of that. So the time relationship, I have to stop and I have to come back to this and explain this. The time relationship to money has to do with how much of your time you will end up having to spend to try and get the life that you're trying to get. Now you can make this the idea that, well, but everybody's time is worth more or less. It's a perspective thing. It's a relative thing, meaning that that somebody's time isn't worth as much as the other. Like, well, okay, I mean, I don't know. I mean, in a combat situation, if you're both in a foxhole, does it really matter if the enemy's closing in on you and you're next to a billionaire and you're broke? I mean, your time is both pretty much equal at that point. So there you have equality, right? In the truest sense, because that's how it works, right? Remember, time is the equalizer, not necessarily dollars, because dollars aren't really worth what you think they're worth. In fact, I would go so far as to say, let me just put this out here. The dollar is the single most the US dollar is the single most worthless currency that has probably ever existed in the history of all mankind. Even the Romans couldn't pull off the worthlessness because they still had to have metals to make their garbage coins. The U.S. dollar isn't even worth that. They can't even buy the garbage metals to make their coins out of, which is why there's a coin shortage, because the metal's worth more. The garbage metal they make their tokens out of isn't worth anything. Chuck E. Cheese tokens actually have more value than this. So this leads into and I'll have to keep coming back to that because it's hard to explain that without somebody asking. It's hard to explain with a one-sided dialogue because it's difficult. I can give the analogies, but I have to actually have sort of a jumping-off point. I don't know. Anyway, so inflation comes from there's two different types of inflation. Now, in the 80s. Okay, late 70s, early 80s, you had a whole bunch of boomers that were kind of coming of age, and they needed to buy cars and houses and get ready to have kids and buy cribs and clothing and on and on and on and on. So demand exceeded supply. That's a type of inflation. That inflation exists through a market phenomena. That's where, how much time I got? Okay, good deal. That exists from a market phenomena. Okay, and so when Paul Volcker raised interest rates back then, he raised them way up like 15% or something. I'm trying to remember all this from just from memory, but when he raised it, what he had an inclining economy. In other words, he had a demographic that was growing with everything. It was coming up as a bubble, right? So with that expanding, you can raise interest rates like that. We actually have a demographic implosion happening currently in the West because people aren't having any kids. See, if you go back, you have to understand some of the history here. When people back in the day, people had lots of kids because mortality was going to be higher, right? So it wasn't uncommon for families to have 7, 8, 9, 10 kids. It wasn't uncommon. As time goes on, there's three things that happen. And the first is that the proliferation of plumbing, indoor plumbing, which creates a more sanitary condition. The next thing that happens is electricity. And in conjunction with those two, electricity just allows for people to have something like a fan, which, makes life a little easier, brings your stress level down a little bit, because you're not just sweating to death in your house, or freezing, because it makes it a little easier to have a more comfortable evening. You don't have to keep the fire going overnight, so you can get more sleep. Life is a little easier. So those two things contribute to making people have lower stress, which means they're going to live a little longer. Compounded with medical advancements. So when you have medical advancements, sanitary conditions and stress levels coming down, people tend to live a little longer. Your mortality rate goes down. So you see this groundswell, this boom, but then all of a sudden, people stop having all the kids. They just, they stop having them. So it creates this whole thing where it now starts to go down, which is why you're seeing the economy doing what it's doing now. It's very predictable, actually, just from a demographic standpoint. It's why they've thrown open the borders and flooded the country, because, well, they need more people. Although it's not going to actually help. It's not going to do what they think it's going to do, because a lot of that is subsidized. See, remember, it's not about how much money you make, it's how much money you keep. And if you're constantly subsidizing something, well, then you're not really keeping enough money coming in. You're just creating more dollars. So that's what's creating all of this inflation that we're seeing right now. And it's not going to go away. The theory that the Fed's doing right now is, well, we're going to try and roll everything back. The solution isn't actually going back. The solution is going forward. What they're trying to do is pull the reins in on all this and do quantitative tightening. Well, yeah, for them it works out really well, because for half of the economy, for them it's going to work out okay. Now, for the bottom half of the economy, they're going to get wiped out. That's just how it is. The bottom half of the economy is going to get completely destroyed. In other words, they're going to go bankrupt before the banks go bankrupt. Now, I would argue that it needs to be the other way around. The banks should go bankrupt, because they're the ones who created all this problem. They're the ones who did all this. This is all short-sightedness on the part of greed, really, that has done all of this. And this is corporate greed, government greed, banking greed, all of it. It's all the same thing. So because of all of that greed, that's what's created these problems. And it's not any one. So, for the people who are out there like, oh, it's all the fault of capitalism. Again, as if we've had capitalism in this like, come on, that's not true. There hasn't been a free market in a very long time. So this inflation that we're going through is very predictable. It's not going to end. If you want to know a solution, solutions are hard, by the way. Most people just know how to move problems. You just make it somebody else's. That's all of corporate America right now. Problem comes onto your desk, and you're like, oh my God, make this somebody else's problem, because I don't want to deal with it. That's a lot of corporate America right now. So the solution, if you wanted a solution, and I don't usually do this, but I'll give you a solution. The solution is going forward. The solution would be, my suggestion would be to immediately implode the dollar. Flood the market with so many dollars that it collapses the dollar into its own footprint, 9/11 style, and then take those worthless fiat garbage dollars and just pay off all your debt. Now, the average American is actually better off by this, because but it'll implode the economy. Like, no, you say that as though this economy is worth saving. Like, for real? Are you being serious with this? Because I would question it. I would question anybody who says that this economy is worth saving. It's not worth saving. It's not. This is a dead issue. You're just going to torture people by doing this, by trying to do quantitative tightening. You're just torturing the people in the back end of this, because there's no way that they're going to be able to get loans to do any of this stuff. We have to go into a little bit of banking history on that. But I'll have to do that when I get into the interest rates portion. But we'll go into the actual kind of the history of banking and why banks existed. I hope that kind of helped. And remember, there's a lot to go. It's hard to actually keep all this stuff in line, because there is so much. Remember when I said in the very beginning, in the primer video, this puts us into everything. It really does. Economics or finance in general. I don't want to say economics. Economics is kind of a overly used word. Finance, personal finance in general, puts you into almost every single topic that exists. And trying to focus on that, because trying to make it to where it's not such a big topic that you can't follow along, but not something so specific that it becomes too difficult for people to relate to. All right. I mean, you can't be too zoomed out and you can't be too zoomed in. You have to kind of hit a little sweet spot. And so that's what I'm going to have to try and do with these videos, is trying to hit that sweet spot to give you something that clicks. And all of a sudden you're like, oh, okay, I get it now. I see what's going on. Because it isn't, it's not going to be you're not going to be able to pigeonhole me. You're not going to be able to put me in any one particular camp of economics because, well, I'm a field researcher. I work in the field. I don't work in academia. Okay, I mean, I detest academia, especially what it's turned into. I'm having to do this stuff for real, in real time, in real life, and I do it with my own money. I'm not doing it with anybody else's money. You're not sponsoring me. I'm not asking for big bales of cash to do all this. I do all this myself. So when you do that, you get a completely different perspective on what you're seeing happen. A quick example. I'm running out of time. Yeah, I'm good. So, quick example. If you want to do an experiment yourself, go into any bank and ask the person there, go to the commercial lender and say, hey, I want to start a business of some kind. Come up with a business. I want to start a business. I want a loan. What they're all going to do is there's going to be this little process you go through, and what they're going to do is they're going to say, they're not going to want to do a loan for starters. They're not going to want to do it. Now, if you have some real estate, like if you've got a $2 million boomer house, well, then they'll do a loan for you, sure, to start your business. They're not lending on the business. They're not lending on your idea. They're lending on, that you got a $2 million boomer home. Well, any retarded chimpanzee can do that deal. I mean, that's, and yes, I am in fact calling bankers retarded chimpanzees, because if that's what you're doing all day, that doesn't take any brains to do that. Somebody comes in with a $2 million boomer home and they want a $400,000 loan to open up a burger place. Sure, man, sign here, whatever. You're pledging your house. Do I give a shit if you pay it back? No, I mean, I've got the $2 million boomer house. So like, what do I care? So that said, that is what a lot of banking has turned into. Go and try all this stuff. Go in and conversely, go in and say, no, I've got nothing. I just have this really good idea that I think is going to work. Now give me money. And they're going to say, no, get the fuck off. Get out of my building. This is exactly what we're going to do. And if you do get far enough to where they say, well, we're going to go ahead, we can do something with you or something. It's usually like a personal line of credit or something like that. They're not actually loaning the business any money. Right? They're looking at your FICO and they're saying, okay, well, this person will probably pay it back, and everything. We'll give you a $25,000 credit card. Go knock yourself out. That's like getting $25,000 of chips at Harrah's or something. Like that's not, that's like going to Caesar's Palace. That's a casino. You're not going to actually do anything with that money. That's going to be anything that's going to be worthwhile. Most people aren't going to be able to start businesses on that small amount of cash. You're just kind of, I get 15 phone calls a day from companies wanting to loan me money, and I keep telling them, no, man, piss off. I don't want your money, because you want 1,800% APR or APY on it. If I take that out the whole, that's loan sharking. I'm not going to do that. So when you understand this kind of stuff, you eventually become, like I said before, keep in mind that as you start to know all this stuff and you start to gauge what's going on, you're going to start seeing all the scams for what they are, and it's not going to make life any fun. It's just going to, and this isn't a fun topic. It's just not. I'm not a fun guy. I'm telling you straight out, this is how a lot of the scams work, right? So, most everything, I think the last video I did, I said, I was talking about the whole casino idea. Well, yeah, it's because that's exactly what it's kind of turned into. It's just sort of like blind luck if you could actually make something that's going to work for you. So, anyway, that concludes this session here. This is the inflation part. Next up, I'm going to go into probably interest rates, so banking, on the next video.